Hi, welcome to In the Can with Carmella Cann. Today we're going to have a discussion on the Trump cases. I'm so excited to have a very special guest. Today we have Manny Antunes, who is a researcher and writer based out of Newark, New Jersey. He's a graduate of NYU Law and clerked for the Honorable Judge McNulty for the United States District Court of the District of New Jersey. He also writes essays about politics and culture for the Newarker magazine. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you, especially since I've known your family for such a long time, including your grandma. So, extremely honored to have you on my podcast. All right, let's talk about Trump. So, Manhattan DA Braggs is trying Trump on 34 counts of falsifying business records during the 2016 election. What are your thoughts on that, Manny?
I think it's a very interesting case because of all the cases that are going on right now, this is the one that goes furthest back, right? It is actually a blast from the past. It'll be 8 years ago this fall, right, that these events occurred. And essentially what happened during that time was, if you remember the Access Hollywood tape, it came out. It was a big deal because there's a lot of questions about Trump of whether or not he was qualified to be president, whether or not he had that temperament. And I think everyone was kind of surprised that he got the nomination for the Republicans to begin with. So it felt like a little bit of an October surprise. And Trump must have known that he had a lot of other skeletons in the closet. But this one in particular, he was worried that might turn into a bigger thing, especially that kind of 1-2 punch of the Access Hollywood tape coming out, talking about grabbing women by their, by their personal area. And if Stormy Daniels had come out with her story of having, had her relationship with Trump, the thought was that would really hurt the campaign. At least that's what the prosecution is alleging. So what the prosecution is saying is that at that time he had Mike Cohen, who's a very famous name now, go and basically give money to Stormy Daniels to not talk about the case. Using the National Enquirer, there's a whole other aspect
to cover up.
To cover it up, basically, because what the National Enquirer had done before that was bought her story. Something that the National Enquirer does that other journalistic outfits don't do, which is they pay money to people to be the ones to exclusively tell their story, or to hold, or even what's called catch and kill, right?
Yeah. I mean, wasn't, the former publisher of the Enquirer, David Pecker, refused to catch and kill the story regarding Stormy Daniels?
So from what I understand is initially I think it was supposed to be a catch and kill.
Okay.
And then it turned into Trump had some kind of line to him and knew about this story existing and that they had essentially the rights to publish it. So by working that back channel, he was able to then have basically Mike Cohen pay Stormy Daniels extra money to not even tell her story at all, right? So-called hush money, right? So that's the allegation, right? So the way this becomes criminal, because actually for people that know out there, like, it's not necessarily illegal to pay someone to tell them not to tell a story. It's actually just kind of part of general contract law. But what makes this a crime, at least according to the state of New York, is that this is really about the election,
exactly.
Right? Trump is arguing, kind of funnily, that this was, he didn't want the story told because he didn't want Melania knowing about it, right? That he had this relationship with a porn star. Go figure. His third wife apparently couldn't know that he was having extramarital affairs. And then, so essentially it's about the election, right? That's what the argument is. And the state of New York has this law which says you cannot falsify a business record. And there are, from what I know, 11 invoices along with a couple other ledger entries. I think they add up to 34 different individual acts that it took to do this, where the payment was made. And what the argument that the prosecutor Bragg and his line prosecutors are making is that payment itself was falsifying, that it was about the election and it was not about some kind of just general payment.
But wasn't the idea that, first of all, that the statute of limitations ran out on all of these. So basically what brings this where he can actually bring charges is because he's tying it, is it to the election?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So there's a couple weird things about Trump, because Trump was president, right? So this actually kind of affects statute of limitations. And this actually kind of matters for some of the other cases we may talk about, which is when you're president, you can't be prosecuted under the law until at least this is the general understanding, until your presidency ends, because the argument is that you don't want a prosecutor, let's say in New York City, tying up the president of the United States. So it's generally thought that that also pauses the statute of limitations for that time being. I actually don't know off the top of my head what the statute of limitations specifically for this crime is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's something like 6 or 8 years, right? As opposed to, let's say, murder, which has no statute of limitations, or other really big crimes, which, you get a longer amount of time. You're right, this is like a long time ago. Everyone's like, we're just thinking about this now. And we knew about Stormy Daniels during his presidency, right? So the fact that it's 2024 and he stopped being president January 20th, 2021 is kind of amazing that we're only just getting this case now.
I mean, it's 8 years later, practically. That's how old this case is. And how do you think the optics look? I mean...
For who? For Trump or for the DA?
For the DA, that it took this long to bring this to fruition. Do you think that this case looks political?
I hate to say this, because as an ex-lawyer, or as someone who worked in a court, you don't want to think of the law as political, because that's the end of the game right there. And then law, we just become almost like a dictatorship or a place without rule of law. But you're right, there is a feeling that this is feeling a little bit opportunistic, right? We all know the name Alvin Bragg. I mean, how many people would know that name in this country if it wasn't for this case, right? And Trump himself is actually putting his name out there because he's on, Truth Social, talking about the DA all the time. And so there is a sense that this is kind of, upping the kind of the notoriety of the DA of Manhattan, right? I have a feeling this case was also in the works, so it may not be Alvin Bragg's case. This might have still been under Cyrus Vance when he was DA. So it's not necessarily his case per se, but you're right, it's giving a lot of attention. So there are some optics there. But as a legal matter, you don't necessarily look into that unless you want to make an argument that Trump, I think, is trying to make his argument, but the judge is not taking to it, which is that Bragg is corrupt and he's just doing this to.
I mean, how strong is the case?
It's like all these cases, they're kind of strong on their own merits, but they're also they're all kind of beside the point, in my personal opinion. This one is probably the hardest of all of them, because you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 New Yorkers. Actually, not even just New Yorkers, Manhattanites. Yeah, specifically Manhattanites. Which is, I don't know if you noticed earlier, there was actually Trump tried to get this trial moved to Staten Island, which is Richmond County. So for those who don't know, New York City, when you get prosecuted, you're actually not prosecuted by the city itself, but in the different boroughs, which are their own counties under New York state law, which means that they have their own court. And so the idea was, if Trump gets over to Staten Island, he'll have an easier time getting someone on the jury.
Well, Staten Island votes mostly Republican versus Manhattan, I would say, leans more Democratic.
I mean, even Queens probably would have been better for Trump than Manhattan. I think Manhattan is, of all the boroughs, I think Manhattan was the one that had the most Trump in favor.
I mean, do you think that DA Bragg has enough evidence to get a conviction here?
I think there's a lot of evidence. So we're going to have 3 major witnesses. Dave Pecker, who owned the National Enquirer at the time, Mike Cohen, who wrote those checks, and then Hope Hicks, who was his communications director. Somehow, it's somewhat unclear how Hope Hicks falls into all this, but she kind of, I think, knew what was going on and was on the campaign and had some visibility into everything. And these all are 3 people who've jumped off the Trump bandwagon. Mike Cohen, most notably, because people often bring up the mob when they bring up Trump, and the way that he behaves, it feels like a mafia boss sometimes. And Mike Cohen's almost like a character going into, kind of ratting on his boss, right? And so he's kind of developed this reputation for that. So there's a lot of evidence there. But the problem with it is there's a bit of, it's confusing, right? Imagine going to a jury and saying, well, Trump did something illegal by writing the wrong thing, by saying that these checks were for personal reasons and not for the election. Which then kind of brings up the question, then why isn't he being charged for election fraud? And that's actually a hard part. I think a lot of the jury members, they might convict him, but I could see someone holding up being like, I just don't understand how this all connects, right? Because you're saying that he made up these records, but he's not being charged with the actual crime, which is to spend money illegally, because it's an illegal campaign expenditure. Spending money to without telling the public that you're spending this money on telling a porn star to not talk about the story.
I mean, recently New York just got, 2 civil cases that he lost. One was brought by Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, on, Trump's civil fraud trial, where Judge Egon ruled earlier this year that Trump organization, top executives conspire to alter Trump's net worth in tax and insurance benefits. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question because that case I find the most interesting of all of them because it goes at the heart of, I think, what Trump is, right? Which is a brand, right? And the Trump company, whatever it's called, I don't know the exact title of it, but that was basically his entry into the world, into becoming the minor celebrity and the major celebrity that he became. And for him to lose that case, it's actually a big deal because that means all the properties, all the branding, all that stuff comes into question, right? He essentially can't do business in New York City, which, despite him moving to Florida and becoming more of a Florida person, is where he has a lot of that clout and a lot of that business clout. And for the Attorney General of the state of New York to come and say, well, the entire thing was just like a kind of racket, I think cuts at the heart of what Trump is as an image, as a figure. And I think for Letitia James, this is another person who people are calling opportunistic because, again, who would know the Attorney General of the state of New York but for this? But I think she's made it a point to actually prosecute him for a lot of stuff that people were a little more reserved about prosecuting, especially a case like, him making up his net worth is something he just basically did all the time from what we can tell.
Do business people in real estate make up their net worth in order to secure loans? Because, there is this argument out there that he's not the only one, but they are going specifically after him because it is political.
So if you're a law student, you learn about something called puffery. Puffery is this thing that we all do. When we're on a date, we talk about instead of saying you're like the associate at a company, you're like, oh, I'm the manager for this, and that, right? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of similar to that. Like, it's not illegal to do that kind of slight exaggeration of the value. But the problem with that specific case is we were talking about the actual value of the properties, and those values are what banks use to decide how much to charge you for taking out a loan against them, right? And that's the kind of hook into it. Otherwise, yeah, you're right. It would just be like if Trump were to go on to a stage and said, I'm the richest person in the world, no prosecutor would prosecute that because it's kind of it's just the kind of stupid stuff that people say all the time. It's not like a concrete thing. What he said was like, I am worth X amount of dollars. And the banks were like, okay, so we're going to charge you, this percentage on interest on the loans for that. And that's illegal. Like when you apply for a mortgage, it's the same thing. When you say, I make this much in income.
And she got a judgment for $464 million.
Not just that, but also she's asking for his ability to conduct business in Manhattan to be ended, right? Which is a power that the Attorney General has. Yeah.
What do you think about the fact that the appellate court lowered the bond to $175 million?
I think that's right. I know it's not popular to say that, but I can tell you as a lawyer, you have the right to appeal a case. And if the act of appealing your case means that you lose everything, because if he has to make that payment right away, I actually think this has to do with E. Jean Carroll, so I'm actually conflating the two things here. But this amount of money that he has to pay, right? If he can't appeal it, that means that you're essentially executing the judgment without the appeal. His ability to say, the court decided this wrong, this is the wrong number. And I think for the judge there to lower the bond is a way of saying, we want him to be responsible. He should put up some money, get the bond, whatever, from some bond company. But we can't, basically end his, basically force him to sell Trump Tower, right?
Of course.
Which is what would happen. There's no undoing that, right? You can't, once he sells it, tell the person who bought it, oh, you have to go sell it back to Donald Trump for the exact amount that you bought it from, right? That's just not something a judge wants to do. So by lowering it, they're admitting, he could still be liable at the end of the day for that full amount, but it's just allowing the court procedure to go along.
To go forward, because he's appealing this.
Yes, exactly.
Now let's talk about E. Jean Carroll.
Yes.
Give us a gist of the case.
Yeah, so E. Jean Carroll, she wrote an advice column for, I think it was New York Magazine for 30 years or something like that. So she was a New York socialite, and who does every New York socialite see at some party? It's Donald Trump, right? And she was part of that same circle of Donald Trump. And in a 2019 memoir that she released, she talked about this incident that happened at Bergdorf Goodman's, and where she was sexually assaulted by Donald Trump. And when she released that book in 2019, Donald Trump then not only denied it, but I think called her a liar and all this stuff. And when you do that, that's defamation, right? And so what E. Jean Carroll did is she sued him. And so this first trial, I think it occurs in 2021, she's basically able to win because she's proved that to a jury that not only that she what she said was true, but that that what Donald Trump was saying about her was defamatory, right? And so the judge issues the judgment. Fast forward a year, Donald Trump starts ranting about her again. And
what she does about everything.
Well, she does about everything. But the funny thing about what Eugene Carroll does is she takes this risk, which I think is very interesting, of saying, I'm just not going to let him keep doing this. So she sues him again. And what you can do is, if this is already, it's called collateral estoppel. If you've already been decided to have said this thing defamatory, and if you continue to say it, you don't have to go to trial over that again, right? It's a civil suit. There's no Fifth Amendment for that. You can basically just say, he's done it again. I just to prove that he did it again. And she got a second judgment. This is where that large amount of money judgment is against him because it's also punitive for him doing it again. But she also tacked on, this is actually not talked about that much, she actually finally tacked on her civil suit for the sexual assault because New York law was changed during that time to allow victims of sexual assault. This is partly because of a lot of what happened with the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts and other groups where people were being sexually assaulted, and they wouldn't talk about it for decades because they were kids at the time.
And
so they were all like, this was changed, and she tacked on a sexual assault claim as well. And so she got it. Yeah, she completely got that.
She got a judgment of $83 million.
Yeah.
And recently, a federal judge upheld the verdict and award because wasn't Trump trying to get this case to go be redone, and they said no.
And no, I mean, and that's just Trump being Trump. I mean, there's nothing special there. It's just he's going to fight every tooth and nail. We see this in all the other cases where every single thing gets litigated, which is annoying for the court. As someone who worked in a court, it is very annoying when with one of the parties, usually the defendant, goes and challenges everything, even the scheduling of things. And so Trump has a bit of this going on where they're literally throwing all the spaghetti at the wall and seeing if any of the strands stick. This is actually kind of what's going on with the appeals for the January 6th case out of D.C. That appeal is kind of that. They're trying to make this like Hail Mary argument, in my opinion, about presidential immunity, right? And so similarly with the Eugene Carroll case, it was just him trying to knock it
let's
out.
talk about that because recently now, the Supreme Court is reviewing that, which many Democrats are saying is going to affect our election because he will not be tried before the election. And, a lot of people are saying that the court is political because of this move. I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, did you think this was the right time to take this on and they're not political, or there was some kind of political motivation behind it?
Yeah, it's so hard because this is such an important question, and it's the worst way to bring up this question because we have this expression as lawyers, bad facts make bad law. And it feels a little bit like that, which is like, of all the cases, do we really want this case to be where this is all decided? But to just give you a little bit of background, so in Washington, D.C., there's a case going on brought by Jack Smith, who's the special counsel that was appointed by Merrick Garland to review the events of January 6th and the events leading up to it to see if there was any liability on the part of Trump, but also some other people. And basically, Jack Smith issued this indictment saying Donald Trump is, they're alleging that he has committed election fraud, obstruction of a governmental proceeding, and all these other things. I think, I don't know if they specifically cited the Insurrection Act. I think they may have, but they're basically calling Trump to task for January 6th. And there's this important question that underlies the whole thing, which is he was president at the time.
Does he have presidential immunity?
Right, basically does he have presidential immunity because this was occurring. If you, it's a very narrow thing. So if he was president and he was speeding, this actually happened with Ulysses S. Grant. You could be prosecuted for that. There's no presidential immunity for that. But the argument that Trump is making is that when he was president at the time, his calling, different people about the election, trying to create the separate state of electors, trying to give that speech in front of the Capitol is all part of him being president and the things that he can do being president. So that's the question. The district court, if I remember correctly, said, no, you don't get immunity for that. This is not an official act. And then there was a panel of circuit judges in D.C. who all three, some of them were, I think one was a Trump appointee, another may have been a Bush appointee, all agreed saying Trump should not, based on the facts in this case, should not get immunity because it's not a presidential act. It's not an official act. And that's what's being appealed to the Supreme Court right now. And the reason why everyone's so nervous is, A, the Supreme Court's taking a lot more time with this than was thought, right? These things are what are called emerging questions. They're very important. They need to be decided very quickly so the trial could go on.
A lot of people are predicting that the Supreme Court's going to come back and rule that he doesn't. And basically what it did was delay that we couldn't go to trial before the election.
So this is the thing that's in the background of all these cases, which
at least that's the optics.
Right. So Trump, should he win in November, becomes president on January 20th, 2025, right? And that for him is going to be a magical moment because in that moment, he gets all these protections, right? So the trick is to keep delaying, arguably delay till November, because I think there's some thought that if he gets elected in November, even though technically he's not president for another 2 months, he will, no one's gonna try to put him in jail between that period because we don't even have a procedure. We don't know what to do, right? If he becomes, if he's a president-elect, and we would put a president-elect in jail. There's no precedent for that. We don't know what to do. So I think Trump's strategy is delay all these as much as possible. Also helps in November because he's not going to be convicted of anything in November. So the hope is that he can stretch it out and then get there, win that battle, and then
I mean, this was an important moment in
Yeah.
this country, January 6th, And then you have people like Mitch McConnell who called Trump out back in 2020 and now are walking back and saying that they're supporting.
Yeah.
So, let me have you watch these clips and I'm going to get your reaction on the turnaround.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth. As Justice Story explained, the Senate, upon conviction, is bound in all cases to enter a judgment of removal from office. Removal is mandatory upon conviction. Clearly, he explained, that mandatory sentence cannot be applied to someone who's left office. The entire process revolves around removal. If removal becomes impossible, conviction becomes insensible. Impeachment, conviction, and removal are a specific intra-governmental safety valve. It is not the criminal justice system where individual accountability is the paramount goal. We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation. And former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one.
Your description of Trump as practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of January 6th and potentially criminally responsible and liable.
I don't know how many times you're going to ask me the same question. I stand by everything I said on January 6th and February 13th of 21.
Well, I'm asking you the question because since the past few months have passed in our last conversation, you've endorsed him for re-election. And you have clear moral clarity as you describe it. You say you still have these beliefs.
You need to get better research. I was asked that question 3 years ago. If he were the nominee, would I support him?
And you said you would support whoever the nominee was.
Because the voters of my party across the country have made a decision. As the Republican leader of the Senate, obviously I'm going to support the nominee of our party.
But you have taken stands on issues you feel morally are of a strong national security interest and morally imperative. That was your argument on Ukraine. And that you were bucking, in some ways, a populist opinion. So on this one, I'm just wondering how you explain that when you say it was good enough for a number of Republicans that he be the nominee. Because that is the populist opinion. It's not taking the position that he has, he doesn't live up to the role.
The issue is, what kind of influence, even if I'd chosen to get involved in the presidential election, what kind of influence would I have had?
You're one of the most powerful
I'm
Republicans.
the Republican leader of the Senate. What we do here is try to make law. I like us to be in the majority. I'm spending my political time and my political capital, whatever amount I have, on trying to flip the Senate so that my successor is the majority leader and not the minority leader.
I understand that. But you are fighting those forces not just in the form of Donald Trump, but all these other senators, including J.D. Vance and others, who are espousing things that he supports that are counter to your worldview.
So what are your thoughts right now about what Mitch McConnell said about supporting Trump when he actually called him out in 2020?
You know what's really funny is Mitch McConnell mentioned in there something very interesting, which is I think he basically said no one cares what he thinks. And I think that's kind of the point, right? I think we're all taken aback by a lot of these politicians, I think Mitch McConnell in particular, because he is in the leadership of the Republicans at least. He takes this big stand on January, the day of, I think it's the day of, January 6th, right? Saying that Trump is culpable for all this behavior and should be held to account. And then 4 years later, almost 4 years later, says, I'm supporting him. And it's kind of what a lot of people have come to expect from Republicans, right? They'll say this kind of big, they'll make this big case about like the importance of the democracy and the republic and all this kind of stuff. But when push comes to shove, this shows you how much they really don't like Biden, or at least their constituents don't like Biden, that they're willing to do that. In fact, I think it's either Mitch McConnell or someone else recently also said, and maybe Chris Sununu, weirdly, of New Hampshire, who's a Republican from New Hampshire, actually a more moderate Republican, who is like, I'm supporting, even though he came out against Trump, I'm supporting Trump because I think Biden is worse for this country. And that's where we are right now. Right?
I mean, you have, a lot of Republicans who know that this is wrong and are still continuing to kind of defend the behavior because it's more important to win than to call it out, that the Republican Party be more in control.
Yeah, I mean, there's that aspect for sure, that they want to obviously have control. But the way they square that circle is to simply say that Biden is also worse, right? Because you have that argument, it's like, yeah, you want power, but like explain to me why I should not, vote for Biden. And they'll argue that, well, Trump may have all these problems. And that's kind of a thing you notice with Republicans. I mean, obviously you get your Marjorie Taylor Greenes who think he walks on water and are willing to kiss that ground that he walks on.
That woman is crazy.
That woman is nuts. I will say that openly, and I don't care. But you're right. You have the problem of like the Chris Sununus of the world, these moderates, right? Who are like, I weighed everything and I'm thinking about it. And like at the end of the day, I think Biden, with whatever they want to argue about, whether it's inflation, whether it's the border, insert topic du jour, right? And they'll say Biden is worse than Trump on that. And I think it's one of those things where you want to try to catch the tiger because Trump is this energy, right? I think a lot of Republicans are jealous, actually, of his ability to create this following of these kind of diehards.
I mean, he's dominating the Republican Party.
And I think that's another thing you mentioned, right? Like the Republican primary was a blowout for the governor, Governor DeSantis, and Governor Haley, or Ambassador Haley. It wasn't that they were like, it was a three-way race and they were roughly equal and Trump edged them out. You combine Haley and DeSantis and their votes don't even equal what Trump was getting. And I think a lot of Republicans saw that and said, this guy is still super popular. I think it would be different. I think a lot of them would be trying to edge him out if he were owning a plurality. But the fact that he commands a majority support among Republican voters is something that they're all afraid of and maybe even a little bit jealous of because they realize that that's where the party lies, right? Which is funny because you would think that these other leaders represent the party, but really they're kind of outliers of their own party, right? They're economic conservatives. A lot of Trump's following, they may say some stuff around like taxes and things, but they really do believe in things like Social Security and Medicare. They don't necessarily want those things gotten rid of. So they're not even aligned. Like Mitch McConnell doesn't necessarily represent the Republican Party at the base.
Finally, let's talk about the Georgia case.
Yep.
So, you know, the judge decided Fani Willis can stay on. Nathan Wade stepped down. And, like, how does the optics of that case come across now? I mean, do you think that Fani Willis should continue on the Georgia case, or she should technically step down?
I think, well, Fani Willis herself will never give up this case because I think this is important to her own career. And I think she really wants to have a future in both Georgia and national politics. And it is a bit craven. I don't want to judge her for that. I think a lot of people do that. I think for me, what makes me most upset about this case, and as someone who was in the law, is that it's just, it's bad because what Trump did was wrong, and that needs to be prosecuted. The election interference in Georgia is a problem, particularly given how close that state was. But then for the lead prosecutor in the county, Fulton County, to have that relationship with a subordinate, it doesn't technically impact the case as a legal matter. Like it's easy for a court to separate that out. But it's just, you're right, it's all about optics. And you have someone here who's just like, you know, this is a post-Me Too era. You know, a lot of Me Too was about subordinates and
It looks like there's
superiors.
a conflict of interest.
Conflict of interest, but not even just, but just like, you know, the fact that relationship existed, right, in a world where we thought we moved on from this kind of stuff, where superiors and subordinates were having romantic relationships, I think is a sign that, like, particularly when Democrats have to really hold Trump to task, we need to be really, really above board with everything. And to have that coming out of Georgia felt to me was like just something that just didn't need to happen. And I think there are a lot of Democrats who, you know, don't want to say it openly because they don't want to undermine Fani Willis because they want the case to succeed, but are probably privately grumbling, being like, this is such a non-issue, but Trump has something now to like really give to the judge. And the judge there is a Georgian judge who, I believe he's elected like most other Georgian judges. So he's probably a little more conservative and is probably not necessarily pro-Trump, but also probably looking for, you know,
I mean,
ways
do you think
to,
that the optics help Trump?
Yeah, for
It
sure.
does.
I mean, the problem is whether or not the jury hears that. I think they'll do a lot of work, the court and the prosecution, to make sure that this is separated from the jury, that whoever gets impaneled on that jury does not hear about that, because it is in a super technical matter irrelevant to the case, right? Despite what Trump might say. I mean, he's making this argument that it's all part of one big corrupt scheme. I don't think that's the case. I think it was just, it's actually just an office matter, really. But I'm sure the prosecutor will be desperate to make sure that their jury doesn't hear about it, because if even one juror hears about it, it may be an excuse for the juror to just put some reasonable doubt into the whole thing. Yeah.
And then finally, let's talk about the documents case. So many right-wing media are saying that Biden also had documents and that the DOJ is political because they're going after Trump. Can you tell us what the differences are there between Biden and Trump?
And they have used the Department of Justice and the FBI to get what they want. Merrick Garland is a mob lawyer. That's what he is. Jack Reed is a rogue Soviet-style prosecutor. The Presidential Records Act is not a criminal statute, and it was never intended to be. The Espionage Act of 1917 was passed under Woodrow Wilson, another corrupt president. Woodrow Wilson used it to go after his adversaries, and they imprisoned 2,000 people. So I suppose over there at the Department of Injustice, and this clown prosecutor spent a lot of time at The Hague, they probably figured these laws could be used to try and entrap Trump. All these obstruction issues that they claim, where the former Attorney General, Bill Barr, comes up here and bloviates about it, and all the formers coming on talking about obstruction. They have them on obstruction. There'd be no obstruction issue of any kind, not even in anybody's imagination, had they not criminalized this case. This is a document case. A document case where a president of the United States or a former president faces 100 years in federal prison. Is this some kind of a sick joke on the American people? Joe Biden says he never told them what to do. Joe Biden had to sign off on that's becoming a National Archives case to have it go to the Department of Justice. Who does he think he's lying to? The American people? This is a guy that's got documents from the time he was in the U.S. Senate, for God's sakes.
It was funny, it's not even just Biden. I think it was also Pence. There was a couple other people,
Exactly.
right? There was a bunch of people. All of a sudden,
Why
it
they're
turns out-
specifically
Yeah.
they actually did bring charges against Trump versus did not.
Yeah, so it's a question of volume and how he behaved. So first of all, you guys have all seen the photos, right? Like just the boxes in the bathroom. I think it was something like 40 or 50 boxes of documents. So there's that aspect. It was just like with Biden, I think it was a folder. It may have been a handful of documents. With Pence, I think it was something similar. And then there's the other problem of just like both of those, Biden and Pence, immediately returned it, did this whole song and dance of just like, I'm sorry, it was an accident, which probably it was. And they got to move on with their lives. And frankly, I think a lot of the special counsels agree. This is kind of more common than they want it to be. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in January when the president switches, right? There's a lot of people moving around. But with Trump, it was like there's a ton of these, and he was showing them to people, right?
Yeah.
These are supposed to be secret documents, so it's kind of crazy, yeah.
I mean, and he's kind of saying that he can declassify.
Yes,
I mean,
with
is
his mind.
there a process that one has to go through to declassify documents?
There is. The problem is they're making this more interesting argument, which is that the president is above that process. Like if you're a normal bureaucrat, you have to follow this process. But because the president is the head of everything in terms of the government and the chief bureaucrat, essentially, there's this argument that conservatives are making that just by taking the document itself, the president has declassified it. They cannot. It's a kind of Nixon argument. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression with Nixon, when the president does it, it's not illegal. It's kind of that thing, yeah.
I mean, of course, the right-wing media is selling this as though, the DOJ is being political. Yeah. I mean, again, do the optics here make it
I think that matters.
help him?
I think the optics here are a little bit more in his favor, you're right, because they're going to look at it as like Biden did it too, Pence, even his own subordinate did it as well, so why is this guy being held to account? Yeah. I think the optics are a little bit better for him on this one.
Manny, thank you so much for coming on today. We learned a lot. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and also stay tuned for more podcasts.